The silence in my father's study didn't just feel heavy, it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest, a suffocating blanket of mahogany and old money. My brother Julian sat across from me in the high-backed leather chair that had belonged to our father, Silas Sterling. The light from the green-shaded desk lamp caught the sharp, aristocratic edge of his jawline, the same jawline our father had carried with such terrifying authority. For 32 years, Julian was the sun, and I was merely the moon, orbiting his brilliance, reflecting a light that was never truly mine. He was the star athlete at the academy, the Ivy League scholar who could charm a stone, and the chosen one destined to lead the Sterling architectural empire here in Chicago. I was Elias, the younger brother who stayed in the shadows, Honori, the one who worked twice as hard for half the recognition, the one who stayed late to fix the blueprints Julian took the credit for. But tonight, the shadows were speaking back, and they had a voice like a landslide. In my hand was a manila envelope that felt like it was vibrating with the force of 1,000 lies. It contained a simple consumer DNA test I'd taken on a whim during a genealogy kick, and the results for Julian, which I'd managed to secure after a minor health scare, required a compatibility check for a potential bone marrow match. The data on these pages didn't just suggest a discrepancy, it screamed a void. There was no biological link, none, zero, nil, between Julian and the man buried in the Sterling family plot. The golden child was a ghost in our genealogy. I looked at the results again, so the black ink blurring before my eyes. Probability of relationship, 0.00%. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a total erasure of the reality I had lived in since birth. Every memory of Julian being praised for his sterling features or his natural leadership felt like a sick joke played by the universe. He was an interloper, a beautiful fraud sitting in a dead man's chair, and I was the only person on earth who knew the truth. My heart hammered against my ribs, a rhythmic reminder that my blood was real, even if his wasn't. Before we go deeper into this story, take a second and hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like, and let us know where you're watching from here on Family Secrets and Revenge. I'm curious to know how far these stories travel. Julian looked up from his tablet, his eyes cold, gray, and predatory. You've been staring at that paper for 10 minutes, Elias. If you're looking for a loan to cover your gambling debts or whatever hobby you've picked up this month, the answer is still no. I have a legacy to protect, and you're a liability. He didn't know. He had no idea that the crown he wore was made of thin, cheap glass, and I was about to throw the first stone. My hand trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline of realizing that the man who had bullied me for 3 decades was an intruder in his own home. He was a king without a kingdom, and I was about to serve the eviction notice. To truly understand why this revelation felt like a nuclear bomb in a glass house, you have to understand the Sterlings. In the high society suburbs of Lake Forest, Illinois, we weren't just a family, we were an institution. My father, Silas, one was a self-made titan of industry. He didn't just build skyscrapers, he built monuments to his own ego. He was a man who believed that blood was the only currency that mattered. He expected his sons to be as rigid, towering, and flawless as the steel beams he moved across the Chicago skyline. I remember him standing over a model of the Sears Tower, pointing his gold fountain pen at the pinnacle. "A building is only as strong as its foundation, Elias," he'd say, looking right past me to Julian. "And Julian is the cornerstone of this family." My mother, Eleanor, was the social glue that kept the facade polished, a woman who valued optics and breeding over oxygen itself. She navigated the charity gala circuit like a general leading a campaign, ensuring the Sterling name remained synonymous with excellence and heritage. She taught us how to hold a crystal glass before she taught us how to ride a bike. In our house, a stain on a shirt was a tragedy, and a failure in school was a sin. We lived in a museum of our own making, surrounded by oil paintings of ancestors who looked down on us with judgmental eyes. Julian was the firstborn, the crown prince of Lake Forest. From the moment he could walk, he was groomed for the throne. He received the private tutors from Oxford, the vintage Mustangs for his 16th birthday, and the permanent seat at the head of the boardroom table. He was the physical embodiment of Silas's dreams. I was the insurance policy. I was loved in a quiet, secondary way. The spare tire kept in the trunk just in case the primary one blew out. And I grew up watching Julian manipulate our parents with a practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was perfect on paper, a masterpiece of social engineering, but behind closed doors, he was a different animal entirely. He was cruel, calculated, and above all, intensely entitled. He truly believed the sterling blood in his veins made him a superior species. He looked down on the commoners who worked for us, never realizing he was one of them. He treated the world like it was his personal playground, and I was just another toy to be tossed aside when he was bored. The doubt didn't start with the DNA test. It started as a low-frequency hum, a whisper from a woman who was standing on the threshold of the afterlife. 6 months ago, our longtime family housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, called me to her bedside in a hospice ward in Evanston. She had worked for my parents long before Julian was born. During that mysterious, lost year in the late 80s when my mother lived in total seclusion at our summer home in Maine, while Silas was overseas managing a massive, multi-billion-dollar project in Dubai. The official story was that Mom needed the sea air for a delicate pregnancy. "Elias?" Mrs. Gable whispered, her hand gripping mine with a strength that surprised me. Her breath smelled like peppermint and medicine. "Look at the dates. You're a smart boy, an architect. You know how things are built. Look at the eyes. Your father was gone for 14 months. He didn't come home once. Not once. And then Julian arrived in his arms at 9 months old. They told us he was premature, but he was a giant of a baby. On 10 pounds if he was an ounce. At the time, I thought she was delirious, her brain foggy from the morphine. I dismissed it as the ramblings of a fading mind, a final flicker of servant-class gossip. But once a seed like that is planted in fertile soil, it grows. I started looking at the family portraits with new eyes. Silas had dark, deep-set brown eyes and thick, coarse black hair. Julian was fair-skinned, with striking, icy gray eyes and a lithe, athletic frame that looked nothing like the heavy-set, barrel-chested sterling stock. I remember one specific evening, shortly after Mrs. Gable's death, when I stood in front of the portrait of my great-grandfather, Alistair Sterling. He had the same broad shoulders as Silas, the same Roman nose. I looked at myself in the mirror next to the painting. I saw the resemblance, the same curve of the brow, the same stubborn set of the mouth. Then I looked at Julian, who was pouring a drink across the room. He had a narrow face, high cheekbones, and ears that sat differently on his head. It was a genetic puzzle where the pieces were forced together with a hammer, and I was the only one brave enough to notice the cracks. I began to realize that the sterling look Julian was praised for was actually just a lucky coincidence of features that looked vaguely expensive and aristocratic, but they weren't sterling. They were a lie told in flesh and bone. I didn't want it to be true. Despite the years of resentment, despite the way Julian had humiliated me at board meetings and mocked my inferior design sense, with the thought of my mother's betrayal and the massive fraud being perpetrated against our family name was a bitter pill to swallow. I began digging through the dusty archives in the attic of our Lake Forest estate, looking for old medical records, letters, anything that could prove Mrs. Gable wrong. The attic was a graveyard of old memories, trunks filled with moth-eaten clothes, boxes of architectural drafts, and stacks of journals. I eventually found Julian's birth certificate tucked away in a locked cedar chest, hidden beneath my mother's old wedding veil. It looked official at first glance, issued in a small, coastal town in Maine. But I'm an architect. I notice details. I notice when a line is a fraction of a millimeter off. The font on the date of birth didn't perfectly match the rest of the document. The ink was a slightly different shade of black, as if it had been printed on a different machine months after the original paper was made. When I cross-referenced the name of the attending physician, Dr. Eris Thorne, I found a dark history that had been buried for decades. Dr. Thorne had his medical license revoked in 1992 for irregular adoption practices and running what the papers called a baby mill for wealthy socialites who couldn't conceive. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't just a simple affair. I was looking at a high-level conspiracy involving human trafficking and falsified records. I needed biological proof. Julian was a creature of habit and vanity. He went to an elite gym in the city 3 times a week. One afternoon, after a game of racquetball where he'd spend the entire time mocking my backhand and calling me the little shadow, he left a used water bottle in his gym bag while he showered. I took it. I felt like a criminal, my palms sweating as I tucked the plastic bottle into my briefcase. I sent the swab off to a private lab along with my own sample. I told myself I was just looking for peace of mind. I lied to myself. I was looking for a weapon to end the war he had been waging against me since we were kids. I was looking for the detonator to blow up his perfect stolen life. The results arrived on a Tuesday. It was a gray, drizzly day in Chicago, the kind of weather that makes the skyscrapers look like ghosts fading into the mist. I was at my desk at Sterling & Sons, the office my father had built from nothing. I remember the smell of the burnt coffee in the break room and the sound of the distant sirens on Michigan Avenue as I opened the encrypted PDF. My eyes blurred as I read the percentages. 0% shared DNA. We weren't even half-brothers. There wasn't a single genetic marker tying us together. Julian wasn't just a non-Sterling. He was a complete stranger who had been masquerading as the heir to a dynasty. He had spent 32 years eating at our table, spending our money, and lording his superior heritage over me, and it was all a lie. He was an interloper, a cuckoo in the nest. I sat there for an hour, just staring at the screen. I thought about all the times Silas had told me to be more like Julian. I thought about the time Julian broke my arm when I was 7 and told the parents I fell, which when they believed him because he was the honest one. And yet, because of the way the family trust was structured, he was currently positioned to inherit 60% of the assets, the majority stake in the firm, and the deed to the Lake Forest estate. My father's will was written with a very specific traditionalist phrase, "To my biological firstborn son." Silas was a man of blood and soil. If Julian wasn't biological, he didn't just lose his position, he lost his legal existence within the Sterling family. He was effectively a ghost in the machine, a shadow that had been given a name. Before we continue, take a second and share your thoughts so far on this story below. I read every single one. If you found out your perfect sibling wasn't actually related to you, would you keep the secret to protect the family? Or would you expose the truth, especially if they were as arrogant as Julian? I sat in the study, the manila envelope resting on my lap like a loaded gun. Julian stood up, checking his reflection in the gold leaf mirror and adjusting his silk tie with an air of practiced nonchalance. He looked like the king of the world, unaware that his palace was built on a sinkhole. "I have a meeting with the board in 20 minutes, Elias. I'm proposing we sell off the historic division. It's dead weight. Try not to mope in here all day. It's bad for the brand to have the VP looking like he's at a funeral. Maybe go for a walk. Get some sun. You look pale, even for you." "The brand," I repeated, my voice steady, surprisingly calm. The fear had evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity that felt like ice water in my veins. "That's all that matters to you, isn't it? The Sterling name? The prestige? The idea that you're better than everyone else because of who your father was? You really think you're made of different stuff than the rest of us, don't you? You think excellence is in your marrow." "It's who we are," he said, heading for the door without looking back, his leather shoes clicking on the hardwood. "Some of us just carry the weight better than others. It's called genetics, Elias. You either have the fire or you don't. You've always been a little lukewarm. It's a shame, really." "It's who I am, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade. He stopped mid-stride. He turned slowly, a smirk playing on his lips. That same condescending look he'd given me since we were children. The look that told me I was nothing. "Whoa, what is that supposed to mean? You're having a midlife crisis a decade early? Or are you finally admitting you're not cut out for this? Because I have work to do, and I don't have time for your riddles." I didn't say a word. I simply slid the DNA report across the mahogany desk. It glided over the polished surface, catching the light, and stopped right in front of him. "It means you're a guest who stayed too long. You're not a Sterling. You're not even a legal heir. And by the end of the week, Julian, You're going to be a nobody, no name, no money, and no home. Read it and weep." The silence that followed was so thick I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, each tick sounding like a hammer blow. Julian didn't scream. He didn't cry. He walked back to the desk with a slow, mechanical gait, picked up the paper, and then read it. Then he read it again. The color drained from his face in a way I'd never seen before, leaving him looking like a marble statue of a fallen god. Beautiful, but cold and broken. His hands started to tremble, just a little, the paper crinkling in his grip as the reality of his own non-existence began to set in. "Where did you get this?" he hissed, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a jagged rasp. "Who did you pay to fake this? Is this some pathetic attempt at a coup? Because if it is, I'll have you in court before dinner. I'll destroy you, Elias. I'll make sure you never work in this city again. It doesn't matter where I got it, and you know it's not fake. Look at the lab credentials, Julian. Look at the markers. You've always known you didn't fit, haven't you? That's why you try so hard. That's why you're so desperate to be perfect. You're overcompensating for a void you felt your whole life. Who are you? Where did Mom get you? Was it a bargain? A transaction? Did she buy you to keep Silas happy when he realized he couldn't replicate himself?" He lunged across the desk, grabbing me by the collar of my shirt, his knuckles white. The smell of his expensive cologne was overpowering, a scent of success that now felt like a stench. "You think this changes anything? Dad loved me. I was the one who stayed by his side when he was dying. I built that company with him while you were playing with your little charcoal sketches in the corner. You're just a bitter, jealous little boy who can't handle being second best." "Dad loved his son," I retorted, shoving his hands off me with a strength I didn't know I possessed. I stood my ground, looming over him for the first time in my life. "He loved the legacy he thought you carried in your blood. If he knew the truth, he would have wiped you from the books before the ink was dry. And now I'm going to do it for him. This isn't about jealousy, Julian. This is about the law. This is about the fact that you are an imposter in my father's house. You have been living a stolen life for 30 years, and the debt is finally due." I left Julian trembling in the study and drove straight to my mother's penthouse on Lakeshore Drive. The elevator ride felt like an eternity, the numbers ticking up as my heart raced. Eleanor was draped in cream-colored cashmere, sipping Earl Grey tea and looking out at the lake, as if the world wasn't about to end. She looked like a queen who had already accepted her kingdom was lost, when a woman who had spent 3 decades holding a crumbling facade together with sheer willpower. I didn't mince words. I didn't offer a greeting. I threw the report on her lap, splashing a bit of tea onto her designer rug. She didn't even look surprised. She didn't gasp. She just closed her eyes and let out a long, weary sigh, a sound that carried 30 years of guilt and exhausted deception. "Silas was sterile," she whispered, her voice devoid of emotion, as if she were reading a grocery list. "The doctors told us after the first 2 years of trying. He was a man defined by his virility, by his ability to create things that lasted. He was devastated. He couldn't handle the thought of his mighty line ending with him. He felt like a failure, and he took it out on me. Every day was a reminder of what he couldn't do. I had to endure his silence, his anger, and his coldness because I couldn't give him what he wanted. He made me feel like an empty vessel." "So you cheated?" I asked, the disgust rising in my throat like bile. "You found a surrogate father and lied to him for 3 decades? You let me grow up as the second-class citizen to a stranger's child just to protect Silas's ego?" "No!" she snapped, her eyes flashing with a spark of the old Eleanor Sterling, the woman who had dominated the Chicago social scene for a generation. "I did what I had to do for this family, for the legacy. We went to Maine. We found a girl, a college student in trouble who wanted a better life for her child. We paid for everything, the medical bills, the silence, the child. Silas knew Elias. He knew Julian wasn't his, but he wanted a son so badly. He wanted a Sterling to show the world that he convinced himself the biology didn't matter. He forged the papers. He created the lie. He was the architect of this entire deception. I was just the laborer who followed his blueprints to the letter." My world tilted on its axis. The floor felt like it was turning into water beneath my feet. If Silas knew, If the great Silas Sterling was a willing participant in this lie, then the specific wording in the will wasn't a mistake or a tradition. It wasn't a sign of his old-fashioned values or his obsession with bloodlines. It was a calculated, timed explosive. It was a test set by a man who was an architect, even in his personal relationships. Wait, I said, my mind racing through the legal ramifications, connecting dots I hadn't seen before. If Dad knew Julian wasn't his biological child, Aaron, he still intentionally put the phrase, "to my biological firstborn son" in the will. He wasn't talking about his firstborn in terms of age. He wasn't talking about Julian. He was setting a trap. My mother looked away, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the gray water met the gray sky. You were the miracle, Elias. 2 years after we got Julian, I got pregnant. Naturally, the doctors couldn't explain it. They called it a medical impossibility, a gift from the universe. Silas was stunned. He called you his true heir in private, but by then, Julian was already the face of the family. Silas was too proud to admit he'd bought a child. He couldn't cast Julian aside without exposing his own fraud in the illegal adoption. So he lived the lie. He let Julian believe he was the prince while he waited for you to grow up and find the truth. He wanted you to fight for it. He wanted to see if you were strong enough to take what was yours. He didn't want an heir who was handed a kingdom. He wanted one who would seize it with his own hands, proving he was a Sterling by deed as well as by blood. Before we go deeper, I would love to hear your point of view. Tell me what part hit you the hardest in my story, and share your thoughts in the comments. Is it worse that Julian was purchased, or that Silas was essentially testing his sons from the grave? The following Monday, I met with the family's estate attorneys in a glass-walled conference room that overlooked the loop. When I presented the DNA evidence along with my mother's signed affidavit, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from professional courtesy to sheer, unadulterated panic. These were men who billed $1,000 an hour to keep secrets, and I had just handed them a secret that could bankrupt the firm. The Sterling Trust was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. If Julian was disqualified as an heir, every contract he'd signed as CEO, every board vote he'd cast, and the entire power structure of the firm would be thrown into a legal vacuum. Julian didn't go quietly. He was a Sterling by training, if not by blood, and he fought with the ferocity of a cornered wolf. He hired a team of high-priced sharks from a firm that specialized in reputation management and estate litigation. They tried every trick in the book. He claimed the DNA test was tampered with by a jealous younger brother with a history of emotional instability. He filed a restraining order against me, while claiming I was harassing him and causing him emotional distress. He even tried to have our mother declared mentally incompetent, suggesting her affidavit was the result of early-onset dementia brought on by the stress of Silas's death. It was a scorched earth policy. He was willing to destroy the reputation in the mind of the woman who had raised him and protected his secret for decades, all to keep his hands on the Sterling checkbook. He didn't care about family. He cared about the brand. He spent millions of the company's money just to delay the inevitable. But I had the truth, and in a court of law, DNA is the ultimate witness. We spent weeks in depositions, the air in the room thick with hostility. Julian sat across from me, his eyes promising murder, while his lawyers tried to poke holes in the lab's chain of custody. But the science was ironclad, and my mother's testimony was unshakable. He was fighting a war against reality. The climax of the war came during a special emergency session of the board of directors. The room was filled with men in expensive gray suits, veterans of the industry who had known my father for 40 years. They were loyal to the Sterling name, not the men carrying it. They wanted stability, and Julian was a hurricane of controversy. Julian sat at the head of the table, looking every bit the composed, powerful CEO. He had a glass of scotch in front of him and a smirk that suggested he had already won. I sat at the far end of the long table, the insurance policy finally ready to claim the premium. This is a personal family matter that has unfortunately spilled over into the workplace, Julian told the board. His voice smooth as silk, projected with the confidence of a man who believed his own lies. My brother is going through a difficult emotional period. He's grieving in a way that is frankly destructive. This evidence he's presenting is nothing more than a desperate grab for power from someone who has never had the stomach for leadership. We cannot allow this distraction to affect our quarterly earnings. He is a child throwing a tantrum because he's never been the favorite, and he's trying to burn the house down because he can't have the master bedroom. I stood up. I didn't need a script or a lawyer to speak for me. I looked every board member in the eye. Julian, you talk about power and leadership, but power in this company isn't granted by a loud voice or a sharp suit. It's derived from the bylaws. The bylaws state the CEO must be a majority shareholder. The shares are legally tied to the Sterling bloodline. You have no bloodline, Julian. You have no shares. You are an employee who has overstayed his welcome, and you've been using company funds to fight a personal battle you've already lost. That is a breach of fiduciary duty that will cost you everything. I pulled out a second document, a letter Silas had left in a private safety deposit box at a bank in Zurich, with instructions that it only be opened in the event of a title challenge. My lawyer had just secured the release through a court order. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the HVAC system and the distant hum of Chicago traffic 30 floors below. I read my father's final words aloud, and it felt like Silas himself was in the room, his shadow looming over all of us, his voice echoing from the afterlife with the same authority he had used to command armies of workers. To Julian, I gave you my name because I was a man of pride. I gave you my time and my wealth because I wanted to believe a Sterling could be made, not just born, but I could never give you my soul. If you are reading this, it means your greed has finally outweighed your gratitude. It means you have tried to push Elias aside, just as I feared you would. You were an experiment in legacy, Julian, and you failed by forgetting that a Sterling protects his own. Elias is my blood, my miracle, and my true successor. You are my shadow. And as the sun rises on a new generation, the shadow must now vanish. You will be compensated for your time, but your tenure as a Sterling ends the moment Elias stands up and claims his seat. Don't fight him. You won't win. The letter included a set of coordinates to the original adoption records in Maine, hidden in the archives of a defunct law firm. Julian's hands were shaking so violently he had to drop his glass. The amber liquid spilled across the blueprints on the table, soaking into the paper, a perfect metaphor for his dissolving career. The board members looked at each other, the realization dawning on them. The evidence was insurmountable. By my father's own hand, Julian was an interloper. He was out. The king was dead, and the real heir was standing at the end of the table, ready to lead. The legal dominoes fell with a terrifying speed. Within 48 hours, the court had frozen Julian's access to all family accounts. His corporate credit cards were declined at his favorite steakhouse. His name was scrubbed from the digital directories of the Sterling building. By the end of the week, a judge issued an emergency injunction. Julian was barred from the Sterling and Sons offices. He was stripped of his titles, his parking spot, and his identity. He was a man without a country, living in a house that no longer belonged to him, surrounded by the ghosts of a life he had stolen. But the hardest part, the part that felt like the true end of an era, was the house. I arrived at the Lake Forest estate on a Saturday morning with 2 private security guards and a locksmith. The sun was shining, a cruel contrast to the mood inside. Julian was standing in the grand foyer, a single designer suitcase by his side. The golden child looked small, his expensive suit hanging off his frame as if it had been tailored for a different man. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. The house felt empty, the portraits on the walls suddenly looking like they were staring at a stranger. "You're really doing this, Elias?" he asked, his voice cracking, a sound I'd never heard from him, a sound of genuine, raw, human pain. "After 30 years, we played in this yard. We shared a bedroom until we were 10. I protected you from the bullies at school. Does that count for nothing? We are brothers, Elias. Blood or not, you're cold, just like he was. I grew up in your shadow, Julian, and while you were protecting me, you were making sure I knew my place every single day. You made sure I felt small so you could feel tall. You spent 30 years making sure I knew I was the spare. Now, You're finally learning your real place. You're not a Sterling. You're just a man named Julian who doesn't have a last name anymore. You're free, Julian, just like I am. Now please leave. The locks are being changed and the story is over. As Julian walked out the heavy oak doors and down the long gravel driveway, I felt a strange lack of the triumph I had expected. I thought I would feel ecstatic, a king finally taking his throne. But instead, I just felt a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The Sterling legacy, the thing I had fought so hard to claim, was built on a foundation of lies, optics, and a dying man's twisted games. It felt like I had inherited a kingdom of ash. I walked through the house, touching the furniture, realizing that everything I owned was paid for with a lie told to a sterile man. I spent the next month cleaning up the wreckage Julian had left behind at the firm. In my audit, I discovered a darker truth. He'd been embezzling small, negligible amounts for nearly a decade, funneling money into offshore accounts in the Caymans. It wasn't enough to sink the company, but it was enough to show he never truly cared about the Sterling future. He was a parasite, feeding off a name that never belonged to him, preparing for the day the host finally died. He had known, at least subconsciously, that he was living on borrowed time. Every decision he'd made had been for himself, never for the legacy he claimed to protect. He had been planning his escape while pretending to build his empire. He was ready to leave us with nothing. If you were in my shoes facing a situation like this, what would you do? And would you have shown Julian mercy after seeing him so broken? Or was this revenge long overdue? Share your thoughts in the comments below here on family secrets and revenge. I'm really curious about where you draw the line in a situation of total betrayal. Taking over as the undisputed CEO of Sterling & Sons was more difficult than I ever imagined. I wasn't the natural charismatic leader Julian had been. I didn't enjoy the galas, the press conferences, or the power lunches at the Union League Club. I was quiet, methodical, and I preferred the drafting table to the podium. But the employees, the architects who actually designed the buildings, the engineers who ensured they stood, the site foremen who dealt with the mud and the steel, they noticed the change. They saw that I cared about the structure, not just the name on the door. For the first time in 30 years, the Sterling firm wasn't run by ego and fear. It was run by facts and collaboration. I started a mentorship program for the junior architects. I pushed for sustainable designs that Silas would have laughed at. I spent time on the construction sites, wearing a hard hat and talking to the workers. My mother remained in her penthouse, a social recluse who refused to see anyone. She had lost her perfect son and her standing in the Lake Forest community. The scandal broke, of course. The Chicago papers had a field day with it. "The Silas scandal," the headline screamed. "The heir who wasn't." Our stock dipped for a few weeks, but then it stabilized. People realized that the man actually doing the work was still there. I was the one who knew the steel. Julian only knew the shine of the chrome. A year passed. The seasons changed. The lake froze and thawed, and the name Julian was rarely spoken in our halls. Then one Tuesday morning, I received a thick envelope postmarked from a small, nondescript town in rural Ohio. Inside was a letter from Julian. He wasn't asking for money, which surprised me. I expected a demand for a settlement or a threat of a tell-all book. He wasn't threatening another lawsuit. He sent a single grainy photograph of a modest grave in a neglected cemetery, his biological mother's grave. He had found his real family, away from the glass towers. "She died 3 years ago," the note read, written in a hand that was far less steady than the one that used to sign multi-million-dollar contracts. Her name was Sarah. She was a waitress in a diner. She lived in a trailer and loved old movies. She had nothing. Elias. No legacy, no skyscrapers. "You took the Sterling name from me, and at first I wanted to kill you for it. I thought you had destroyed my life, but you gave me the truth. I don't have to pretend to be a titan anymore. I don't have to carry Silas's ghost on my back. I don't have to lie to the mirror every morning. I don't hate you anymore. I just hate that it took a war for me to find out who I actually am. I'm nobody, and for the first time in my life, I can breathe. I'm working at a local construction firm. I'm a foreman. I'm actually building things now, not just talking about them. It turns out I like the work more than the name. I'm finally building my own foundation. It was the first honest thing he had ever said to me in 33 years. It was the only time I felt we were actually brothers, not competitors in a rigged race, but two men trying to find their way in a world that had been designed to keep us apart. I realized that Silas's game had hurt him just as much as it had hurt me, turning us both into shadows of what we could have been. I sat in my father's old mahogany chair, looking out over the Chicago skyline as the sun began to set, turning the glass buildings into pillars of gold. The Sterling name was still on the skyscrapers, but the meaning of that name had shifted fundamentally. It wasn't about perfect bloodlines, Ivy League pedigrees, or being the golden child anymore. It was about the choices we make when the light finally hits the cracks in our lives. I had my revenge. I had the company. I had the house in Lake Forest, though I rarely stayed there. And it felt too haunted by the ghosts of the boys we used to be. But as I looked at the empty seat across from me, I realized that Julian and I were both victims in different ways. We were pieces in a game played by a man who loved his legacy and his image more than he ever loved his children. Silas had created a monster in Julian and a ghost in me, and he'd left us to tear each other apart just to see who would survive. The real victory wasn't taking the company. It was realizing that I didn't need Silas's approval to be a Sterling. I just needed to be myself. I was finally out of the shadow. I was the architect of my own life now, and for the first time, the design felt sound. The Sterling family is a different entity now. We are smaller, quieter, and infinitely more honest. I realize that being a legal heir is just a matter of paperwork and signatures, but being a brother, that's something that requires a type of blueprint we were never given. I kept the DNA results in a frame in my private safe at home, not as a trophy of my victory, but as a reminder of the cost of lies. Secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how much concrete and steel you try to pour over them. And in the end, the truth doesn't just set you free, it levels the playing field until there's nothing left but the people standing on it. I'm no longer the shadow, and Julian is no longer the light. We're just two men, finally living the lives we were meant to have. The empire still stands, but it's no longer a monument to a lie. It's a foundation for the truth, and I intend to keep it that way. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through the Sterling family's darkest hour. This story is a powerful reminder that the people we think we know best often carry the heaviest secrets, and sometimes the perfect life is just a very expensive mask. If this story moved you, or if you've ever had to uncover a family secret that changed your entire world, please thank you for watching and share your overall thoughts based on my story in the comments below. We truly value this community and the stories you share with us here at Family Secrets and Revenge. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, Family Secrets and Revenge, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a moment of cinematic drama and hard-hitting truth. We'll see you in the next story.